All right, guys. Once we get the front row straightened out, we'll be fine. All right. Hello to you at home watching us, or maybe you're watching us on Thursday. I don't know. Good to see you, though. All right. Let me get organized. Phone's off, so none of y'all can call me. That's good. It does happen. All right, take your Bibles. Turn to 2 Timothy chapter 3. We're in the home stretch as far as these pastoral epistles go. And really, these last two chapters of 2 Timothy have a lot of familiar verses. The ones we're going to look at tonight about the end of time and how people act and how all that plays out, we know those pretty well. And then in the next few weeks, we'll get into the all Scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof. That's coming up soon. And so then you get, being poured out like a drink offering. So there's just a lot of familiar stuff in these last two chapters of 2 Timothy. In the paragraph before this, towards the end of chapter 2, starting in verse 14, we have for instance, verse 15, be diligent to present yourself approved to God as a workman. And so Paul's been making a contrast there between people who have not been faithful to the word, and then in verses 20 through 26, very much about what it means to be faithful, where he encourages Timothy, like in verse 22, now flee from youthful lust and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace for those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. So when we get to chapter 3, we're going to look at verses 1 through 9 tonight. Paul begins to make a larger application. He's been talking very specifically to Timothy here, and now he's going to warn Timothy about what to expect in the end of time, which the assumption is Timothy's living then in the end of time, because we all are living in the end of time. Ever since Christ came out of the grave, the end times started on Easter morning. Christ is the first fruits of the resurrection. He was the first one to be raised and to receive his glorified body. We have been in the end now for 2,000 years, but that's why, for instance, John would say the spirit of the Antichrist is in the world. That's why you can just watch history and see what's happening, and how there's always things in place where whenever the Antichrist comes along, people will be susceptible and people will be pulled in. So that spirit's always out there. And so this has been a warning for all generations of Christians. And I think I said this last week. Every generation within the church has thought they were the last one. Somebody will eventually be right? It might be us. It might be 100 years from now. But so far, no one's been right. But we might be right. But people have been just as convinced as we are that they're right. How could you not live through things like World War I and think this has got to be it? The death and the destruction and all of that. How can you not have lived through World War II and saw how Hitler came to power and what he did with the Jews and not think this is it? And yet neither one of those were. There was a big push in the late 1800s. People were convinced in the late 1800s that the end of time was coming. In fact, several denominations got started that way. For instance, Seventh-day Adventists got started as a group of folks who set a date and said, this is when the end of time is. Here's the day and the year and all that. And it didn't happen, and they just sort of, this is a simplification, but they just sort of stayed together and became a denomination. So it's constant over time. And the reason is because everything's been fulfilled. Christ can come back at any time. whether you expect the rapture of the church at any moment or whether you think of the imminence as the 7 years of tribulation are going to kick off at any time. Wherever you fall in that, and people are all over the map as far as Bible-believing Christians go, the principles of the end of time have been around since the day Jesus walked out of the grave. And so it's good for us to know and not be surprised when we see the things described here in verses 1 through 9. So, after that long but short introduction, 2 Timothy chapter 3, 1 through 9, I'll read the whole thing. He says, "But realize this, that in the last days difficult times will come. For men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of godliness, although they have denied its power. Avoid such men as these." Now, I'll come back to that when we get there, but you and I can read this, and it all sounds very much future, because he says in the end times it's going to be like this. But then he comes back to the present and says, Timothy, these people are in the world now, so avoid them. So you see that idea of the end of time is something that's always happening. Verse 6, "For among them are those who enter into households and captivate weak women, weighed down with sins, led on by various impulses, always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth, just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses." And don't worry, if you don't know those names, you're thinking, I don't remember those guys in Exodus. I'll tell you who they are in just a minute. "So these men also opposed the truth, men of depraved mind, rejected in regard to the faith. But they will not make further progress, for their folly will be obvious to all, just as Jannes and Jambres' folly was also." Now, we're not going to get into verse 10, but let me go ahead and read the next few verses so you realize that he's going to give the positive side. We're going to focus on the negative stuff this week. But in verse 10, he says, "Now you," and this is what we'll get into next time, "you follow my teaching, conduct, purpose, faith, patience, love, perseverance, persecutions, and suffering." So after he gives this paragraph to Timothy that we're going to look at tonight and says, here's the negative, here's the ungodly behavior that you need to avoid, then in the next one he says, here's what I want you to do. So he doesn't leave him hanging. We just have to split it up at some point just for teaching purposes. So go back to verse 1. He says, "But realize that in the last days difficult times will come." Well, as I said earlier, we are living in the last days. And the times are difficult, and they have been. Especially, it's really concentrated at different times. So early in the life of the church, those times were extremely difficult, with early persecution and death and, the being fed to the lions and that sort of stuff. And then over time, persecution comes in different waves in different areas. But it's fairly normal. This is one of the things that we as Americans forget, because we are blessed. We have religious freedom, hopefully tolerance. All the things do seem, at least attitudes seem to be changing that way. But we are not the norm for Christians. The norm for Christians throughout history is persecution and suffering and being pushed out of society and those things. But we don't, fortunately, we don't do that. We don't suffer that, which really puts a lot of responsibility on us to be fruitful and to get the gospel to the rest of the world and to show people, what it means to follow the Lord. We have that freedom there, which we should never take for granted, but also realize that we do live in difficult times. And there's going to be times, even for us as Americans, where it's going to get more difficult to follow the Lord. It's going to cost more over time. Now, he calls them difficult times. It's an interesting little word there, sometimes translated as violent. He's not just saying it's going to be uncomfortable. The word has a really much stronger idea than that. In fact, let me read it to you. In Matthew chapter 8, in verse 28, it describes the men where Jesus cast the demons out of them. I'll read it to you. It says, when he came to the other side of the country of the Gadarenes, two men who were demon-possessed met him as they were coming out of the tombs. They were so extremely violent, which is the same word used here as difficult, that no one could pass by that way. That word's only used twice in the entire New Testament. It's used here, and it's used to describe the violence that those demon-possessed men had. In fact, one gospel talks about how you couldn't chain those guys up. They were so strong, they would break the chains and any kind of bonds. That's what we live in. That's what the end times are like. It's violent, it's difficult, it's oppressive. And there are believers throughout the world that are experiencing that now. Whether it be just across the border in Mexico, Mexican drug cartels are killing Christians because they're standing up to them. Whether it's believers in Muslim countries that are being killed for their faith. Whether it's believers in communist China that are being suppressed by godless communistic government. There are people all over the world that are suffering this very actual violence because of their faith in Christ. And that's one of the signs, it's one of the things that you and I recognize that we are in the end times. Now, he begins to describe what people will be like. In verse 2, he says, for men will be lovers of self. Now, let me pause there for a minute. This is the root of the whole thing. Because people are going to worship something. And they're either going to worship the truth, or, for the most part, they're going to worship themselves. So, for instance, in Paul's context, with things like, Greek and Roman paganism, they had gods, had multiple gods, but they were gods created in the image of man. You ever read that mythology, those gods are horrible. They're sinful, and they murder each other, and they do all kinds of terrible, they act like people act. That's what happens when people create gods. They create flawed gods because people are flawed. And so ultimately, paganism is worship of man. And our default, without Christ, our default is self-centeredness, is paganism. And so that's what happens, is people worship themselves. People worship humanity. People will pick one aspect of humanity and lift that up. It comes back, whether it's much of modern day environmentalism is just simply old school paganism and earth worship. I mean, that's all it is. There's nothing new under the sun, right? That's all. It's the same thing. And so that's the default. People will love themselves, make themselves their own Lord, the own center of their universe. People are selfish. And often, even we as believers have to be careful, because when we don't walk with the Lord, when we're not growing in our faith, when we're not doing those things that God has given us to mature, we're going to real fast fall back into this mode, into selfishness. What are most arguments about in marriage? One spouse wants their way, the other spouse wants theirs. It's a self-centered thing. What are most church arguments about? It's about one person wants their way, another person wants their way. It's self-centeredness. What are most road rage incidents about? You got in my way. So it always comes down to self. That's the default. Because we are living in the end of time. People will be lovers of self. Lovers of money. Money. You remember what Paul said in 1 Timothy 6? In verse 10, he said, for the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil. He didn't say all evil, but all sorts of evil. That often gets misquoted. And some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Lovers of money. You see this played out, especially in the last few years. People will make complete fools of themselves on YouTube, right? Because if you really make a fool of yourself on YouTube in some way, and you get enough followers, you can make a living making videos, because those videos have ads on them. And so there are people who are making hundreds of thousands of dollars on platforms like YouTube because the advertisers know 1 million people follow this guy, And he may do, some of that's interesting, some of it's not. A guy may have some specialty where he covers, whatever, some sport and he's got 500,000 followers. Well, if his videos are what they call monetized, he can make six figures just by making videos in his basement and getting enough people to watch them. Well, one of the best ways to get people to watch you is to do stuff that's stupid, because we're fascinated by that, right? Think about it. You remember things like, or things that make you laugh, like even in old network television. Kids say the darndest things. Or I remember as a kid, TV bloopers and practical jokes with Dick Clark and Ed McMahon and all that. We love to watch people fall down and that sort of thing. And if somebody really figures out how to do that and do it well, they can make a living. And it's a love of money. They get rid of all sense of humility, all sense of whatever. And so the fact that we see people lie and steal and cheat and go to prison and all those things is because we're in the end of time. That's the nature of people. So boastful, people bragging about themselves, bragging about their achievements. Arrogant. As I was going through it, one commentator noticed these two go together. Boastful is the action, where arrogant is the feeling. The arrogance is what's on the inside, and then the boastfulness comes out as a result of that. Y'all like being around people that brag on themselves all the time? It's just annoying, right? Like, it's coming. Like, if you really know somebody like that well, not to say one thing. Because if you say something, like, if you ever had a friend or an acquaintance that's always going to one-up you? Like, if you've got a story about whatever, they've got some other story that's going to top it. It just drives you crazy, right? Because we want to be the center of attention. That's what we just saw. And then that person has a story. So this idea, that's part of living in the end times, is the world is a boastful, arrogant place. Revilers, so people who are involved in wickedness. I love that this one's thrown in there because it seems interesting. Disobedient to parents. That always stands out to me, right? Because he's really talked about things that we can, lover of self and lover of money and boastful and arrogant, a reviler, so like this wild partier, and people who are disobedient to their parents. Now, why doesn't he throw that in there so soon? Well, think about the nature of God. How does God describe himself? As Father, as Son. He describes us as being his adopted children. God created family, and he relates to us as family. And so when people are disobedient to parents, they're disobedient in a system that God has set up to reflect his nature. Remember, Jesus got all over the Jewish leaders for this. You go through the Gospels, and they're giving him a hard time about something, and basically he says, look, you guys aren't taking care of your parents. You declared all your stuff. I think the word in Mark is Corban. You said all this, you're not going to give anything to your parents. You're not going to take care of your parents because you've gotten super spiritual all of a sudden, and you're going to give away your money. Well, but you've neglected your parents. So that's what we're called to honor our parents. The commandment doesn't go away, even, when you're not a kid anymore. It just kind of is different on how you do that. And so that's people who are disobedient, disrespectful to parents. That's a sign of the end of time. Ungrateful, unholy. So lives where people aren't grateful for what they have. You see that just in the destruction and just all the things that we see out in the world. Unholy, the wickedness, the sinfulness that we see. Unloving. Think about, the last few years, this focus on bullying and the results of that, and what that does to a kid especially. Where does that come from? It comes from the fact that often we are unloving. And if you get a group of kids together and they sense some weakness in somebody, they pounce. And that's something that has to come out of somebody, that you have to get past because you recognize the love of God. But this is an unloving thing. Irreconcilable. Broken relationships cannot be mended. And then he throws this one in, malicious gossips. That's a fun one to talk about in church, isn't it? But he's talked about disobedient to parents and gossips. He's talking about horrible, horrible things here. Unloving and irreconcilable and, lovers of self and all that. And he says, oh, by the way, gossiping too. The fact that you and I love to pull somebody aside and kind of whisper to one another about, did you hear? Did you know? Or we couch it as a prayer request, Y'all pray for, and then you launch off into this thing, right? That's why we have to watch. We will fall into this mode, even as believers. We actually, of course, nobody reads newspapers anymore, but there's still this thing still exists in a different form, but we actually used to have a thing called a gossip columnist, and where people would, with Hollywood and all that sort of stuff. Well, now they don't call it that. They're just the paparazzi trying to jump out and take pictures. But that's the same idea. And to do it maliciously, so to lie about people, to cause division, without self-control. Back to the road rage I mentioned. I mean, why are people shooting at one another on I-240? Because we live in the end times. I mean, I know that's a simplified answer, but it's the truth. That's what we see. So no self-control. Brutal. You see that just in the violence in the world. Haters of good. This is one of the reasons that you and I are persecuted as believers, is because we understand there is a standard of what is good and what is bad. And God is that standard. How do we know that it is good to not lie? Because God is truth. He is the definition of truth. He's the standard by which everything that is truthful or untruthful is measured against. And to say there is a standard that this thing is good and this thing is bad is offensive to a lot of people because they've chosen the bad. And when you tell them that their bad is not good, now you've challenged their identity, their core belief, their whatever it might be. And there's reaction to that. So it's haters of good. Because to hate good means that you have rejected a standard. You said, I don't care. I'm not going to do that. Verse 4, treacherous. So just all kinds of maliciousness and just evil. Reckless. This goes back to, I keep going, I hope none of y'all have had an incident today, but a road rage incident, right? Where, all right, we live right off Walnut Grove. And I don't know what happens on the weekends. It doesn't do this during the week, but especially on Saturday. And we're where it goes down to 2 lanes, right? As you're going towards Houston Levee. There are people, you can sit in my backyard, well, my front yard too, on Saturday from, I don't know, probably about 10 in the morning till late at night. And if you listen, you can hear people going up and down Walnut Grove. I know they're doing 100. I mean, because they'll blow past me. I don't know how anybody hadn't been killed there. I mean, it's just 2 lanes, and it's just ditches on the other side. I mean, and people are, and they chase one another up, and I mean, this happens all the time. It's reckless. It's a lack of a sense of what life means, and you see that in the world. You see things that just don't make any sense. Conceited. This word for conceited, the root means smoke. So it's being puffed up. Sort of walking around, like you're the best thing that's happened, since sliced bread, that sort of deal. So conceited. Lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. That's the world. If it feels good, do it. There's no standard there. It's simply the pleasure. Now, he gets into a false version of following the Lord, because this happens too in the end times. Holding to a form of godliness, although they have denied its power. And then he says, avoid such men as these. So if you'll remember in 1 and 2 Timothy, in Ephesus, there was a false teaching there. And that false teaching, going back to 1 Timothy, was they had taken the genealogies, the Old Testament genealogies, and just made up a bunch of stuff and used that to lead people astray. The women that he's going to talk about in a minute have fallen into that trap. And so these people who have led people astray and who have caused people to sin and have caused division and heresy and all of that, put on a front that they are religious, that they're believers, in other words. This is why it is so important to be discerning about who you listen to within Christianity, what preachers you listen to. Because there are guys out there who look the part, who are good speakers, who have thousands of people, but they don't preach the truth. And you've got to be discerning enough to catch it. And sometimes it's that they don't really say anything at all. Good old Joel being the best example there, right? But there are guys who lead people astray on purpose. These are cults. You know, why do you think? One of the things, for instance, within the Mormon church, just in my lifetime, the Mormon church has tried to set itself up to be evangelical or to be just like us. And it's not. It's heretical. It's wrong. It's false teaching. Now, they're nice people. They make good neighbors, probably great employees. I voted for Romney, didn't win, I think we missed a chance to, have him in. We got Obama instead, but I won't get off on that. Unless you want me to. No, y'all don't want me to get off on that. Good folks, nice people. Why? Because they think you have to work your way to heaven. Right? The nicest people in the world are the ones that think you have to earn your salvation. That just makes sense when you think about it. But they believe all kind of crazy stuff about Jesus, about Satan, about what salvation actually is, about going and being the Savior on another planet somewhere because you've been a good Mormon. I mean, just odd things, right? And yet they try to present themselves as being just like you and me, and it's absolutely wrong. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about people who do these things, have a form of godliness, but they've denied its power. So they've denied what actually matters. They've denied Christ. They've denied the power of the death, burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. And because of that, he's warning us. He's warning Timothy and he's warning us, avoid these people. Avoid these men. Stay away from them. A little bit of advice. If a Mormon or Jehovah's Witness or somebody shows up at your house and you don't know much about what they believe, all right, don't engage. They've been trained to mess you up. Unless you really know your stuff about what they're saying, because they're going to use the same language that you and I use. They're going to use the same words, but they're going to mean different things. For the most part, the best thing to do is just send them on their way and not even get involved with it, because they're not going to hear from you, right? They won't even, like you, they wouldn't even accept a church bulletin from you. Some of these folks, like Jehovah's Witness, they can't read anything that, our Bible translation, or they wouldn't take a piece of Sunday school literature from you or anything like that. And so you're not going to be able, it was super rare for you to even be able to engage in an actual gospel conversation with them. So for the most part, just keep yourself safe and just send them on their way. And hopefully they'll encounter somebody that knows how to engage them. Years ago, we had 3 different, these were the Mormons, right? Yeah. We had 3 different teams of Mormons show up at our house. I just started seminary, and just kind of studying all this stuff. And the first one showed up, and it was 2 really young guys. And then the next group was one of those guys and sort of the guy above him. And the next group was the guy that was above him with the guy that was above him. And then they quit coming. And I haven't had any at my house since. I think they've tracked me, like they know where I live. Because they don't come. But just avoid them unless you've really studied what they believe and are able to do it. Just do what he says here in verse 5. Avoid such men as these. Now, because here's what happens if you don't. Verse 6. For among them are those who enter into households and captivate weak women, weighed down with sins, led on by various impulses. For some reason there in Ephesus, these false teachers were able to come in and lead these women astray. And to cause them to stumble and to get them to follow false teaching. Because notice how they couched it. Verse 7, always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Because that's how people who claim to teach the truth, this is how cults work. They'll tell you, we know the truth. We know how this really is. And your church, they're just lying to you, or they don't have the inside track. They haven't been enlightened yet, or however they do it. And if you're not ready for it, then they can lead you astray very easily. They'll come in and say, especially years ago, this isn't so much anymore because the King James King James is still the number 1 or 2 Bible as far as sellers go. But 30 years ago, most Southern Baptists are going to be carrying a King James. Well, Mormons carry a King James. And they'll tell you, they'll sit in your house and say, we use the same Bible, but they don't mention they've also got the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants and all those things that they actually hold up as Scripture that if push comes to shove will supersede anything that's said in the King James Bible. But if somebody's sitting there and like, oh yeah, that's the same Bible. And they'll say, we're saved by grace through faith just like you are. Oh, okay, well I didn't realize that. Well, they don't mean the same thing that we mean. When they say we're saved by grace through faith, they're just talking about the fact that there's going to be a resurrection at the end, and then if you're a good Mormon, you may or may not get to go, to your own planet. There's a level of rewards. But they sound like they're saying the same thing, and if you're not astute, you will fall for that. And so that's what's happened to these ladies. They have fallen for the false teaching that these guys have brought in through the genealogies. And ultimately, he gives us an example. In verse 8, he says, just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so these men also oppose the truth. Men of depraved mind, rejected in regard to the faith. Now, who in the world are Jannes and Jambres? Because if you pull out your concordance, you're going to find they're only mentioned here. And you're like, wait a minute. They're saying they're with Moses. Who are these guys? Well, remember Paul is Jewish. Timothy came, partly from a Jewish background. Within Jewish history, these two names are associated. This is outside the Bible, but apparently this is something that's stuck through Scripture or through the times of the Exodus. These are the fellas who were the magicians for Pharaoh in Exodus. The ones who mirrored a lot of what Moses was doing and then finally couldn't anymore. These are those guys. So that's what he's talking about. He's talking about that competition and those who were there with Pharaoh who were trying to do things and to oppose Moses. They were opposing him. You remember they couldn't, what was it they finally couldn't replicate? It was the creation, I think I'm right. I should have checked this before. They couldn't turn the dust into gnats, I think is where they finally got tripped up. Because it was creating something. They couldn't fake it, because most likely they were faking it. Or there was an occult power there, one or two. But they finally got to where they couldn't mirror what was happening. And I think that's when it was when the dust was turned to gnats. But that's who these fellows were. They were opposing Moses, so they were opposing the truth. Moses was representing God, who is the truth, and he describes them as men of depraved mind. That's what false teachers are. They're people of depraved mind. They lead God's people astray. It says they're rejected in regard to the faith. They claim to know the truth, but they're not actually following. And then I love this little encouragement there at the end that ultimately they're not going to win. It says, but they will not make further progress, for their folly will be obvious to all. So he's talking about believers, just as Jannes and Jambres' folly was also. They eventually could not replicate what was happening with the plagues. So Paul, at the end of this paragraph, reminds Timothy and reminds us, these people are out there. False teaching is out there. Avoid these people. They can lead you astray. They have led people astray. But know that in the larger scope of history, they will be proven wrong. Because where's history heading? We're in the end times. Where's that heading? That's heading to the return of Christ, to the ultimate revelation of the truth, to the physical return of Christ to the earth. And so those false teachers aren't going to be able to teach falsehood anymore because Christ has returned and they're ultimately cast into the lake of fire. So there's a little note there in verse 9 saying, But understand, all this is going to work out in the end. People get led astray now, and that's tragic because there are people who are led astray who never hear the truth. You know, I feel for the kids, especially, who are born into cults. They never know any different. I was talking to somebody about it last week, that they know a little boy who's a Mormon, just talking about how nice he is and all that sort of stuff, and the family's nice, but they understand it's tragic because they're not following the truth. I mean, they're lost. And, you know, nice folks, but lost. It's terrible. So you and I have to know the truth. So here's the point of the thing. Here's the sentence I wrote out. Since we live in the end times, that's the assumption, we know that's true. Since we live in the end times, then we must be diligent to recognize and avoid false teaching. So we have to be diligent to not only recognize false teaching, but also to avoid it. So here's what that means. You shouldn't listen to somebody that you know is a little bit off just because you like the way they say it. Right? Hagee, John Hagee is a good example. I don't even know if he's still around. But, you know, he has some wrong views about how salvation works, but he's fun to watch, you know. But you shouldn't listen to him, you know. So, because if I remember right, he thinks there's 2 ways to be saved. There's only one, you know. So don't let that stuff. If a guy can be entertaining, but he's teaching falsehood, don't watch him just because it's fun to watch. Because that stuff will get into you and confuse you and lead you astray. So you got to recognize it. And how do you recognize what's false? You got to know what's true. So you've got to be in the Word. You've got to be studying. You've got to know. Now, there are a lot of things you and I don't understand about Scripture, right? The minutia sometimes can get confusing. You know, what was I reading this morning? I'm in Revelation right now, part of my quiet time, and it's where he's talking about the woman and the serpent and, you know, times and a half and all those things that you get in Revelation, you know, 11 and 12 and all of that. And I think I understand that, but I might be wrong about it. You know, there's kind of things. Or you get into some of the prophets in the Old Testament and you're clueless. Like, Jeremiah, what are you even talking about? I don't know. You know, what is Ezekiel even talking about with all those wheels spinning in one another? I don't know, right? That's okay not to know those things. But we know the big stuff. We know that Christ died. We know that he rose again. We know that he's coming back. We know that we're saved by grace through faith. We know the core is clear. The core is absolutely clear. So one of the best ways to recognize a false teacher, the first question to ask, and I'll end on this. The first question I always ask about somebody is, what do they believe about Jesus? Because cults always get this wrong. That's why they're cults, right? And so if you'll just check that, that'll tell you. Like if there's a group you've heard of, you're like, I don't know who these people are. Find a statement of faith, see what they say about Jesus, because they're going to mess up there, and then you know not to mess with them. If they get Jesus right, they may stumble somewhere else, but for the majority of the time, especially with cults, they're going to get their doctrine of Christ wrong. And so that's a good way to discern who you're dealing with here. So be diligent to recognize and then avoid false teaching. So, well, guys, that is 2 Timothy 3, 1 through 9. Those of you who were watching, thank you all for being here. We're going to log off here in a second and take some prayer requests. But if you have any questions or anything you want to talk about, send me an email, John, John, at mycbcc.org, or send a Facebook message as well. That's one way to do it. The only people that will see it are the administrators, and we can respond to that as well. We're going to log off now here, and thank you guys for being here tonight. We appreciate it.